Welcome to Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosities, a production of iHeartRadio and Grim and Mild.
Our world is full of the unexplainable. And if history is an open book, all of these amazing tales are right there on display, just waiting for us to explore. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities. If you ask the average American what they know about Catherine the Great of Russia, they'll probably say nothing. And that's a shame, because she was one of the more effective rulers in Russian history. Catherine the Great was actually Prussian, and her original name was Sophie. After she married into the Russian royal bloodline, she quickly took power and transformed the country from a stalled feudal state into a modern imperial power. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. It's ironic that Americans don't know much about Catherine because they might just owe her their country. The story of Catherine's involvement in the American Revolution starts in 1775 with a man named Sir Robert Gunning. He was the British ambassador to Russia at the time, and he was given a difficult task: request Russian military aid in America. It was a tricky situation for two reasons. For one, Sir Robert needed to keep the British monarch, King George III, from looking like he was begging. And second, he really needed the request to be granted. The Americans were doing much better than expected in the war. They had both France and Spain on their side. Sir Robert and his colleagues carefully drew up a 10-point treaty to present to the Russians, clarifying everything from the number of troops they were asking for to how much the troops would be paid. They wanted to come across as competent and authoritative. Gunning first met with Catherine's foreign policy advisor, Nikita Panin, who gave Sir Robert the impression that England's request would be granted. Why shouldn't two monarchs help each other out? But the matter still needed to be approved by Catherine herself. Sir Robert met with her and Nikita, expecting to finalize the details of the arrangement, but he failed to realize that Catherine had other plans. She treated the request with some shock, and she would never agree to send troops to America. She thought that the whole America business was embarrassing. How could George have allowed it to spiral so out of control? Nikita feigned shock as well, claiming that he thought the request was to send troops to Spain and not America. To add insult to injury, Catherine dictated a letter for Sir Robert to deliver directly to King George. She used over-the-top language to make it clear to her fellow monarch where she stood. She addressed it to "my brother," and claimed that the American Revolution was, and I quote, "a rebellion which no foreign power supports." Even so, she gave a firm no in writing. "Nor can I stop thinking about what should have resulted from our own dignity if two monarchies and two nations had thus joined of our forces simply to calm a rebellion." In other words, she thought it would look tacky for two monarchs to team up just to defeat the Americans. Little did Sir Robert know, he was caught up in a larger web that Catherine was weaving. Catherine wasn't necessarily for or against the Americans. She followed the principles of the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual movement in Europe at the time, emphasizing reason over superstition and the rights of the common man within a monarchy. So, while she wouldn't have believed in the revolutionary concept of American democracy, she would have seen George's heavy taxation of the Americans as misrule. She also saw the opportunity to broker peace in Europe. By refusing to support the English, she further isolated them, as they were already at war with France and Spain. You may have wondered why so few foreign powers intervened in the American Revolution. Well, in 1780, Catherine formed the League of Armed Neutrality, a diverse coalition of nations like Denmark, Sweden, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire that agreed to protect one another's shipping interests, and they all agreed not to enter the war on either side. By 1783, England had no real allies, and they agreed to end the war with both America and France. The United States was born, and there was peace in Europe. Catherine had established herself as a major player in European politics. Perhaps she would have behaved differently if she had known how the future would unfold. As centuries later, the United States is Russia's greatest international rival. Oh, how curious history can be. No joke at the expense of an entire nationality is ever fair or good. Whether aimed at underrepresented groups who can't defend themselves or countries with a heritage that folks in a certain era had prejudice against, these wisecracks can often be insulting. But in very rare instances, you can see how real events from history might have helped make those jokes possible. Take, for example, the Great Whiskey Fire. It was a real-life tragedy that occurred in 1875 and one of the largest fires in the Irish city of Dublin's history. The fire began in Malone's Bonded Storehouse, a building in the Liberties, a Dublin neighborhood known for its pubs and distilleries. We don't know exactly what triggered the blaze, but in retrospect, the situation was asking for trouble. Malone's storehouse alone held some 5,000 casks of undiluted whiskey and other spirits. This can be dangerous since the volatile, high-proof spirits give off flammable fumes that can seep through the wooden containers. And on one hot summer evening in particular, those 5,000 casks were a powder keg waiting to go off. Around 8 p.m. that evening, smoke was seen drifting from the storeroom. The first cask exploded, then another, and another. A chain reaction of bursting barrels, each one spraying hot, flaming liquor across the warehouse. Soon, the entire building was a billowing inferno. As the walls collapsed, a river of flaming liquor was released. It flowed into the streets, igniting everything in its path and plunging the Liberties into chaos. In addition to pubs and distilleries, the neighborhood had several large tenement houses, as well as pens where livestock were housed. Soon, the streets were teeming with squealing pigs, galloping horses, barking dogs, and entire families, all of them racing to keep ahead of the spreading blaze. Meanwhile, a crowd gathered to gawk at the fire. Some onlookers saw the river of burning whiskey as an opportunity for a free nightcap. While people ran home to get pots and pitchers, others simply knelt and cupped the whiskey in their hands or scooped it into hats or boots. And this revelry continued well after the authorities arrived on the scene. The police quickly arrested the most inebriated onlookers, some of whom were now trying to rescue barrels of whiskey from buildings that had yet to catch fire. Meanwhile, the Dublin Fire Brigade got to work controlling the blaze. Captain James Ingram quickly realized that the fire would be a challenge to contain. Dousing the streets with water would simply cause the flames to spread to new areas, since the burning liquor would float on top of the water. He tried building dams of gravel to block the flow, but the whiskey soaked right through, carrying the flames with it. At that point, Ingram realized he needed something thicker. In a burst of ingenuity, he sent his men to the nearby manure yards, where the excrement created by the city's countless horse-drawn carriages was stored. The firemen came racing back with wheelbarrows full of dung, which they dumped onto the street to block the burning liquor. And this thankfully contained the blaze, while rendering the whiskey undrinkable. The fire and the party were finally over, but the cleanup was still getting started. As dawn broke, authorities began to take stock of the damage. Adjusted for inflation, 6 million euros worth of whiskey had been destroyed, and that's not even accounting for the property damage or the physical injuries. And 13 people had been killed, although curiously, none of them suffered from burns or smoke inhalation. In fact, they weren't directly affected by the fire at all. All 13 of them had died of alcohol poisoning from drinking the undiluted whiskey. History is full of tragic tales, none deserving of a joke. So let's remember the Great Whiskey Fire of 1875 for what it really was, an accident followed by a party that ended in a curious disaster. I hope you've enjoyed today's guided tour of the Cabinet of Curiosities. Subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts or learn more about the show by visiting curiositiespodcast.com. This show was created by me, Aaron Mahnke, in partnership with How Stuff Works. I make another award-winning show called Lore, which is a podcast, book series, and television show, and you can learn all about it over at theworldoflore.com. And until next time, stay curious.